The most produced Allied tank of the Second World War had a wet ammunition storage system. It had been redesigned, retested, and certified safe by the United States Army Ordnance Department. The fix worked. Engineers confirmed it in 1944. The crews were still dying. Not because the fix failed, because the fix reached fewer than 40% of Shermans in the field before the war ended. The other 60% kept the original design, wet storage or dry. The tank had a second problem the Ordnance Department had also documented, also understood, and also decided not to prioritize. The engine sat directly beside the ammunition racks. A single penetrating round, not even a kill shot, just a penetration, could set off a chain reaction that gave the crew approximately 4 seconds to get out. Most didn't make it. The cruise calls it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. The advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." They weren't wrong. To understand why the Sherman existed, you have to understand what the United States Army believed a tank was for in 1940. The answer was not fighting other tanks. American Armored Doctrine, as written by the Armored Force and endorsed by Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, held that tanks were infantry support weapons. Their job was to break through defensive lines and exploit the gap. Tank versus tank combat was the job of tank destroyers, a separate vehicle class, faster and lighter, built to kill armor while the Sherman pushed forward. This doctrine shaped every decision that followed. It meant the Sherman didn't need to defeat a German Panzer IV in a straight fight. It needed to be fast, reliable, simple to maintain, and producible in numbers large enough to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. On those terms, the design made sense, completely coherent sense. The M4 Sherman entered production in February 1942 at the Pressed Steel Car Company in Joliet, Illinois. By the end of the war, 11 manufacturers across the United States and Canada had produced 49,238 of them. Nothing in the Allied inventory came close to that number. The British received roughly 17,000 under Lend-Lease. The Soviets took 4,102. The man most responsible for the production architecture was General Levin Campbell, Chief of Army Ordnance from 1942 to 1946. Campbell understood logistics the way other men understood tactics. He knew that a tank that could be built in 3 days and repaired with standard tools was worth more to a modern army than a tank that could destroy anything on the battlefield but took 6 weeks to manufacture and 3 specialists to fix. He was right about that, and he was about to be catastrophically wrong about something else. In a conventional tank ammunition system, shells are stored along the hull walls and floor. They sit in metal holders surrounded by the tank's own armor. The logic is simple. The armor that protects the crew also protects the ammunition. The problem with that logic is what happens when the armor fails. A penetrating hit doesn't just enter the tank, it enters at velocity, shedding fragments in every direction, generating heat, sometimes generating sparks. In a tank with ammunition stored against the hull walls, a penetrating round has a direct path to the propellant charges surrounding every shell in the rack. Propellant doesn't explode the way a shell does. It deflagrates, burns fast, produces enormous pressure, generates a pressure wave that can detonate the shells themselves. The technical term is a catastrophic ammunition cook-off. What it looked like from outside was the turret leaving the hull. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground documented this failure mode during M4 development in 1941. The report noted that the dry ammunition stowage configuration created unacceptable fire risk on hull penetration. The recommended solution was wet stowage, surrounding the ammunition racks with a water glycol mixture sealed in a secondary container. A penetrating round hitting the rack would encounter fluid before propellant. The fluid absorbed heat. The propellant didn't ignite. The wet stowage solution worked. Testing confirmed it. The redesign was authorized. It was also slower to manufacture, added approximately 280 pounds to the vehicle weight, and required modification to an already running production line. The first wet stowage Shermans, the M4A176W variant, didn't reach combat units until the summer of 1944. By that point, the original dry stowage configuration had been in combat in North Africa since November 1942, 19 months. There was a second problem the wet stowage fix didn't address. The Sherman's engine was a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, the same basic design used in the Curtiss White Whirlwind family. It was air-cooled, relatively compact, and well understood by American mechanics. It also sat in the rear of the hull, in close proximity to the fuel lines, and, depending on the specific variant, within fragment distance of the hull ammunition racks. Not every Sherman fire started in the ammunition. Some started in the engine compartment, fuel lines ruptured by fragment spray. The air cooling system that made the engine easy to maintain also made it efficient at feeding a fire with oxygen. An engine compartment fire in a Sherman gave the crew longer than an ammunition cook-off, sometimes as much as 15 to 20 seconds. That sounds better. It wasn't really. 15 seconds inside a burning tank through a hatch that required both hands to open from inside, with a 75-pound turret casting hot fragments in every direction, was not a survivable increment of time for most of the men who experienced it. British crews received their Shermans in 1942. Within weeks, Royal Armoured Corps after-action reports used a specific phrase to describe the vehicle's fire behavior: brewed up. Easy, routine, expected. By 1943, American crews had their own phrase. The Ronson lighter had been advertised since the 1940s with a guarantee: lights first time, every time. The name transferred without irony. It was accurate. It was also the kind of accuracy that only exists in situations where the men on the receiving end have stopped expecting anything better. The Ordnance Department knew about the fire problem. That isn't an interpretation, it's documented. A formal report filed in January 1944 by the Allied Armored Fighting Vehicle Technical Assessment Team, based on battlefield recovery of destroyed Shermans in Italy, concluded that ammunition fires were responsible for approximately 65% of total Sherman write-offs, not crew injuries, write-offs, tanks destroyed beyond repair. The report reached the desk of Ordnance Chief Campbell within the month. Production continued unchanged. The official reasoning, reconstructed from departmental correspondence, operated on two tracks. The first was the doctrine argument. Shermans weren't supposed to be fighting Panthers and Tigers. If they were encountering high-velocity anti-tank fire at close range, something had already gone wrong at the tactical level. The tank's fire vulnerability was a consequence of misuse, not design failure. The second track was the numbers argument. By January 1944, American industry was producing Shermans at a rate of approximately 2,000 per month. Retooling for wet stowage across the entire production run would have reduced output for an estimated 3 to 4 months. At 2,000 vehicles per month, that was 6,000 to 8,000 tanks. In the context of a war that was about to require the largest amphibious landing in human history, a 4-month production gap was not a trade Campbell was willing to make. There was also a third factor, less documented but present in the record. The wet stowage modification had been approved and was entering production. From the Ordnance Department's perspective, the problem was being solved. The solution was in the pipeline. The question of how many crews would die in dry stowage vehicles before the pipeline delivered was, in the language of military procurement, a transition cost. The men absorbing that transition cost didn't know they were in a transition. At the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, American and British armor suffered some of the highest single-engagement Sherman losses of the war. German after-action reports noted with a kind of technical detachment that Sherman fires were visible from artillery observation positions several kilometers away. Not individual tanks, concentrations. The fires were a navigation aid. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, received crew casualty reports from the engagement and wrote in his diary that the Sherman's fire problem was, in his phrasing, a matter that should embarrass someone in Washington. He did not specify who. Nobody in Washington appears to have been embarrassed. What happened instead was quiet. The wet stowage variance increased as a percentage of production through late 1944 and into 1945. By the end of the war, most Shermans coming off the line were wet stowage. The problem was being solved on the production side, while the original vehicles continued to serve and burn in the field. The British, who had been documenting the problem since 1942, developed their own internal modification kits and pushed them into field maintenance channels. Some crews welded additional armor plating over the hull ammunition areas without authorization, using steel salvaged from destroyed vehicles. It added weight, degraded mobility, and was technically against regulations. It also worked. The Ordnance Department did not adopt the field modification, too non-standard, too difficult to track. The men doing it weren't doing it because they'd watched their friends burn. By May 1945, 49,234 Shermans had been built. Approximately 8,700 were destroyed in combat in the European theater alone. Fire was the leading cause of write-off in armor recovery records. Exact casualty figures attributable specifically to ammunition fires are not cleanly separable in the record. The Army's casualty tracking didn't classify by cause of tank destruction. What survives is the aggregate, roughly 57,000 American armored vehicle crew casualties across all theaters, Europe and Pacific combined, in a vehicle that comprised the majority of American armor. Not all of those were Sherman fires. Not all Sherman losses were fire-related. The numbers are not clean. What is clean is the sequence of events. Engineers identified the problem. They designed a fix. The fix was authorized. Production continued with the unfixed design for 19 months after the fix existed. And the men who died in that 19-month window died in vehicles the Ordnance Department had already certified for correction. Preserved Shermans exist in museums on 4 continents. The Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset has 3. The National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning has more. They sit behind rope barriers, lit by track lighting, surrounded by school children on field trips who look at them the way you look at something old and large and inert. They don't look dangerous anymore. That's the thing about solved problems. They stop looking like what they were. The Sherman was not a bad tank. It was a procurement decision wearing armor. The dark part of this story isn't that the Army built a tank that burned. It's that they knew, fixed it on paper, and kept sending men into the unfixed version anyway. That's not engineering failure. That's institutional arithmetic. And the men doing the math weren't the ones inside. If that's the kind of history you want, the engineering truth behind the machines, subscribe. There's more where this came from.